Now, this was not always the case. The great English Catholic writer G.K. Chesterton, in his autobiography, mentions that before 1914, his father, an estate agent, came home shocked one day because an agent had offered him to advise the purchaser to pay a higher price in return for a bribe. In other words, he was betraying his client. This was a novelty, Chesterton thought, and the general level of commercial morality was high, because his father was completely horrified by this and said nothing like it had happened before, although it subsequently began to happen more frequently. But I would argue that the reason why Chesterton's father was shocked and the reason why the level of commercial morality was high at the time was because the level of general morality in a public sense was high in late Victorian and early Edwardian England. Both the failure of the agency principle and the decline of professionalism, both government and market failures, however, illustrate what happens when society and economy dispense with the need for doing good and trust in the conceit of the perfect design of perfect incentives. In other words, if we don't have a general high quality of morality in our society, we cannot expect our economy to reflect. We must expect it to have a low quality. John Paul II addressed this folly in his third great social encyclical, Centesimus Annus, and I obviously bow to the greater knowledge of it by the first speaker. But he there identifies the source of modern wealth neither as raw materials nor as possession of the means of production, but as knowledge, know-how, creativity, or, in economist language, human capital. Since everyone has got ability of some kind, he or she has a responsibility to develop those qualities as fully as possible. In turn, society has an obligation to smooth people's path to knowledge and to combat exclusion. An economy is to be judged as just or unjust by how effectively it opens access to knowledge and skills. And the Pope concluded, in some contrast, I would argue, to previous church teaching, and even in contrast to some earlier into his first two social encyclicals, that a free economy is most likely to achieve that aim best, but only if it is shaped by an independent culture of virtue and trust and operates within the framework of humane and liberal law. Indeed, he saw the economy, the state, and the culture as three independent but mutually reinforcing and correcting sectors. And I would argue that as the economy increasingly becomes the arena of imagination and creativity, then the third cultural sector is likely to be significantly more important in influencing economic organization and development. I think that is happening. If you look at our economies today, creativity and imagination are far more evident at all levels in companies and in societies and in the economy than they were, say, in the 1950s. And I mean in the 1950s in Britain and America. The problem is this increasingly influential culture is less and less one of virtue and trust. So what virtues should shape the economy? What does Christianity have to say about the virtues of about building a commercial society, and how can we encourage the restoration of trust? Well, Christianity is first commonsensical, it seems to me, on the creation of wealth. It sees wealth creation as a good thing, but one that should be subordinate to the higher values of holiness and the next life. Christianity has a place for such ascetic values as a life of voluntary poverty, namely the monastery. But it regards such things as a counsel of perfection unsuited to the everyday lives of most Christians, and indeed to the long-term well-being of society. Extreme asceticism and such practices as lifelong chastity are self-evidently going to be minority tastes because they're incompatible with such institutions as the family. Wealth creation is similarly a legitimate and desirable social aim, and the wider its benefits are spread, the stronger the moral case for the system. Ceteris paribus, therefore, an economic system that produces the greatest wealth for the greatest number is likely, not certain, but likely, to be better in accord with Christian values than systems with other priorities such as economic equality. But what are some of the moral principles that should otherwise guide us in relation to these questions? Different civilizations built on different religions will give different answers to this question. These answers will overlap, and the greatest concordance will be found in prohibitions on fraud, deceit, robbery, and of course non-economic crimes such as murder. But when we go beyond these agreed boundaries, we cannot expect full agreement with others. My own view is that there are universal truths discoverable through right reason in natural law, but it is evident that there are no universally agreed values. And the attempt to impose the values of Western secular liberalism through international law on non-Western societies, and on Western societies to some extent, will often, but when we impose them on non-Western societies, they see them as Christian values in light disguise. That attempt to use international law in that way is bound to fail, and let me say, rightly bound to fail. International law has to be limited to either a lowest common denominator of moral values or, in practical terms, to arbitrating disputes between states. If we are modest in our agreement to establish generally agreed rules internationally, we will succeed far more in practice than if we seek total agreement on such questions. In this area, as often, the best is the enemy of the good. But we we Europeans, live in a post-Christian society. Less true in Poland than in Western Europe. But even a post-Christian society is a special kind of Christian society. What then does our civilization have to say? Well, our civilization derives from both Christianity and the Enlightenment. I am aware, of course, about the nonsense of the European Union refusing to include reference to Christianity in what would have been the preamble to its Lisbon Constitution. But I think, whenever the Economic Union gets into discussing these moral and religious questions, it does stumble very badly. You may recall that a few years ago, when the Turkish Parliament passed a piece of legislation that would have made adultery a criminal offence, the European Commission issued a statement saying that this law was inconsistent with European values. Now, we Anglo-Saxons had always thought that adultery was a European value, but it was interesting to have it officially confirmed by the European Commission. So, I don't like what the mention of Christianity out of a kind of list of European historical achievements, but that, of course, is not that. But I'm not surprised by it, and I think it's best if it keeps out of this kind of thing by and large.